There are places in the Ozarks where the mountains remember things older than names, where the ridges fold into themselves like the wrinkled hands of something ancient, clutching secrets in limestone fists. In the autumn of 1899, in a hollow so deep that sunlight reached the valley floor for only 3 hours each day, 2 women lived in a cabin that should not have stood where it did. The structure perched on ground too unstable for foundations, on a slope too severe for level floors, yet there it remained, plumb square and defiant of every geological probability. The sisters who inhabited this impossible dwelling were known to the scattered homesteaders of Newton County, Arkansas, only as the Hadwin women, though no one could say with certainty whether Hadwin was their family name, their married name, or simply what they called themselves when they descended from their isolated homestead twice, yearly to trade dried herbs and carved bone trinkets for lamp oil and salt. The elder sister, Maeve, possessed the kind of stillness that made men uncomfortable, not the placid calm of domestic contentment, but the watchful immobility of something waiting behind tall grass. Her eyes, pale as creek water over limestone, seemed to track movement that existed just beyond the peripheral vision of those who spoke to her. The younger, Renna, moved through the trading posts like smoke, her hands perpetually stained with substances that shifted color depending on the light, sometimes rust, sometimes ash, sometimes the deep purple-black of pokeweed or old blood. Neither woman smiled. Neither offered unnecessary words. They conducted their business with the efficiency of ritual, as if each transaction followed a script written long before their birth, and when they departed, they left behind a silence that felt less like absence and more like presence withdrawn. The disappearances began in late summer, when the air hung thick as wool and the cicadas screamed their dying songs from the oak canopies. First was Thomas Wicklow, a timber surveyor working the eastern ridges for a lumber company out of Springfield. His crew reported that he'd gone to mark a stand of walnut trees in a drainage basin, 2 ridges south of the Hadwin property, and simply never returned. Search parties found his surveying equipment laid out with geometric precision on a flat boulder, his field notebook open to a page of measurements, his pencil resting in the book's fold as if he'd set it down, intending to return in moments. But Thomas Wicklow was gone, and the only tracks leading away from that boulder were his own walking in a straight line toward a limestone outcropping, then ending abruptly at the rock face as if he'd walked directly into stone. 3 weeks later, a trapper named Cyrus Heath vanished from his own trapline. Heath was a solitary man who'd worked the Ozark Hills for 20 years, a man who knew the terrain with the intimacy of long marriage. His traps were found sprung but empty, arranged in a line that led steadily uphill toward the hollow where the Hadwin sisters lived. The final trap in the sequence sat just beyond the tree line that marked the boundary of their property. Beyond that point, the ground showed no sign of passage, no bent grass, no disturbed leaf litter, nothing to indicate that Cyrus Heath or anything else had walked there in generations. By September, when the maples began their slow burn toward crimson, 5 people had disappeared from the hills surrounding the Hadwin homestead. The pattern troubled Sheriff Coleman Briggs, a man whose tenure in office had been marked by the mundane crimes of rural poverty, theft of livestock, disputes over property lines, occasional violence born of whiskey and old grievances. These vanishings possessed a quality that unsettled him in ways that ordinary crime did not. There was too much intention in the details, too much deliberation in how each disappearance unfolded. The missing left behind scenes that looked less abandoned than arranged. as if they'd been participating in some ceremony that required they step away from their lives with their affairs in perfect order. Briggs assigned his deputy, a young man named Michael Thorne, to ride up to the Hadwin property and question the sisters. Thorne was 24, ambitious, and possessed the confidence of someone who'd yet to encounter anything that couldn't be explained, arrested, or reasoned with. He departed the county seat on a clear morning in late September, his horse fresh, his sidearm cleaned and loaded, his saddlebags packed with enough provisions for 3 days in the hills. He told the sheriff he'd be back by nightfall of the second day at the latest. Michael Thorne did not return by nightfall. He did not return the next day or the day after that. On the morning of the 4th day, his horse wandered into the livery stable in town, still saddled, its reins trailing. The animal was lathered despite the cool morning, its eyes rolling white, and when the stable hand tried to calm it, the horse screamed, not whinnied, but made a sound that echoed off the stable walls like a woman's shriek. In the saddlebags, neatly folded, were Thorne's clothes. All of them: his shirt, his trousers, his undergarments, his socks, his hat, folded with the precision of a man preparing for inspection. His gun belt lay coiled atop the stack like a sleeping snake, the revolver still in its holster. All 6 chambers loaded. Sheriff Briggs stood in his office and stared at the pile of clothing laid out on his desk like evidence from a murder. Except there was no body, no blood, no sign of struggle. Only the methodical absence of a man who'd apparently undressed himself with care before vanishing into the Ozark wilderness. The implications paralyzed rational thought. Briggs had served in Cuba, had seen men torn apart by artillery and disease, had witnessed death in forms both sudden and lingering. But this careful erasure of a human being activated a more primitive dread. He touched the fabric of Thorne's shirt, still smelling faintly of sweat and wood smoke, and felt the weight of decisions he didn't want to make. By afternoon, he'd assembled a party of 12 men. Not volunteers. Briggs had learned decades ago that volunteers in situations like this brought enthusiasm that curdled into panic when circumstances turned strange. Instead, he requisitioned men, 2 deputies from neighboring counties, for seasoned hunters who knew the terrain and possessed the temperament for difficult work, 3 war veterans whose capacity for processing horror had been thoroughly established in the Philippines, and to county officials whose presence would establish that this expedition carried legal authority. They departed at dawn on a cold October morning, the mountains exhaling mist that clung to the valley floors like breath made visible. The ride to the Hadwin property took 7 hours, following game trails and logging roads that switched backed up ridges of increasing severity. The forest closed around them with the inevitability of a fist, the hardwoods giving way to pine, the pine giving way to cedar and limestone outcroppings that thrust from the earth like broken teeth. The men spoke little, their conversation dwindling as the altitude increased, as if the mountains imposed their own silence as toll for passage. By the time they reached the final ridge before the hollow where the Hadwin cabin stood, even the horses had grown quiet, their hoofbeats muffled by centuries of leaf fall and the peculiar acoustic properties of landscape that seems to absorb sound rather than reflect it. The cabin appeared exactly as described, a structure of weathered oak logs chinked with clay and moss, a shake roof dark with age, a stone chimney from which no smoke rose despite the afternoon chill. It sat on impossible ground, the foundation somehow leveled despite the 30-degree slope of the hillside. A split-trail fence enclosed a yard of swept dirt, empty of everything except a stone well and a woodpile so precisely stacked it resembled architecture more than stored fuel. No chickens scratched in the yard. No dog announced their arrival. The windows, for in total, reflected the afternoon light with a blank opacity that suggested either shutters within or glass so old it had begun its slow transformation back to sand. Sheriff Briggs dismounted and approached the front door, aware of his men arranging themselves in a loose perimeter behind him, hands drifting to weapons they hoped they wouldn't need. He knocked 3 solid strikes that echoed across the hollow and returned as flattened sound, as if the mountains were listening but choosing not to respond. For a long moment, nothing. Then the door opened inward, revealing not the dark interior one would expect, but a precise rectangle of illumination, as if the cabin's interior possessed its own light source, independent of windows or lamps. Maeve Hadwin stood in the doorway. She wore the same dark dress she'd worn at the trading post months earlier, or perhaps an identical garment, and her pale eyes tracked across the assembled men with the methodical attention of someone counting inventory. She did not ask why they'd come. She did not express surprise at the presence of 12 armed men at her threshold. She simply stepped aside, pulling the door fully open, and spoke her first words in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever. "You'll want to see the cellar." The statement possessed the quality of prophecy rather than prediction, as if Maeve Hadwin knew with absolute certainty not only why they'd come, but what they would ask for, what they would find, and how the encounter would conclude. Briggs felt something cold slide down his spine, not fear exactly, but the recognition that he'd stepped into a narrative already written, that his choices from this point forward existed only within parameters established by something beyond his comprehension. The cabin's interior contradicted every expectation. The space was larger than the exterior dimensions suggested, the ceiling higher than the roofline indicated possible. The walls were lined with shelves bearing jars of preserved substances, plants and roots, and things that might have been plants or roots but possessed geometries that seemed incorrect for vegetation. A table dominated the central room, its surface scattered with what appeared to be maps, though the topography they depicted bore no resemblance to any terrain Briggs recognized. Symbols marked various locations on these maps, characters that suggested language but belonged to no alphabet he'd encountered. Rena Hadwin sat at the table, her stained hands moving across one of the maps with the deliberate motion of someone tracing familiar paths. She did not look up at the intrusion of 12 men into her home. Her attention remained fixed on the map, her finger following lines that seemed to shift and reconfigure as she touched them, as if the document were updating itself in response to her guidance. The younger sister's presence generated an atmosphere of intense concentration, the air around her seeming to thicken and slow, as if time itself moved differently within the radius of her attention. "The cellar," Maeve repeated, and moved toward the back corner of the cabin where a trap door lay flush with the floorboards. The door was constructed of planks so perfectly fitted that the seams between them were nearly invisible, and when Maeve bent to lift it, the hinges made no sound, not the silence of well-oiled metal, but the absence of friction, as if the door existed in a state slightly divorced from the physical laws governing the rest of the structure. The opening revealed stairs, descending into darkness so complete it seemed less the absence of light and more the presence of something that devoured illumination. Briggs had brought lanterns, good brass lamps with clean wicks and fresh oil, and when he lit the first one, the flame burned with normal vigor till he lowered it into the stairwell. The light dimmed immediately, not flickering but simply losing intensity. As if the darkness below possessed density that resisted penetration. "It doesn't like fire," Renna said from the table, her voice carrying a note that might have been amusement. "You can bring them, but they won't help much." Briggs looked at his men, saw his own disquiet reflected in their faces. The two deputies from neighboring counties had gone pale. The hunters shifted their weight, hands on rifle stocks. The war veterans showed no expression at all, which was somehow worse than fear. It suggested they recognized something in this situation that transcended normal danger, something that operated according to rules learned in contexts most men never survived. "Deputy Thorne," Briggs said, forcing his voice to remain level. "We're looking for Deputy Michael Thorne. He came here 4 days ago." "He went down," Maeve said, gesturing toward the open trapdoor. "They all do eventually. The cellar calls them, and they answer. That's how it's always worked." "Who built this cellar?" one of the deputies asked, his voice pitched too high. "No one built it," Renna answered, finally looking up from her map. "It built itself, or it was always here, or it exists in a place where building and being are the same thing. Language doesn't really accommodate what it is." Briggs felt the investigation slipping away from him, felt reality becoming negotiable in ways that made documentation impossible. How would he write this in a report? 2 women in an impossible cabin above an impossible cellar discussing architecture that defied causality. He made a decision born of desperation. He would descend into the cellar, would document what existed below, would find either Deputy Thorne or evidence of his fate, and would use those findings to construct a narrative that courts and newspapers could process. He selected 4 men to accompany him there, 2 veterans who showed no fear, and 2 of the hunters who knew how to move quietly in darkness. The remaining 7 would stay above ground, would prevent the sisters from closing the trapdoor or fleeing, would serve as witnesses to whatever emerged from below. Briggs gave explicit instructions. If they didn't return within 2 hours, ride for town and bring back the state militia. Do not enter the cellar. Do not attempt rescue. Just seal the cabin and wait for authority greater than county. Jurisdiction. The descent began with stairs, 23 steps of smooth stone that showed no chisel marks, no tool scars, as if they'd been formed rather than carved. The temperature dropped precipitously with each step, the cool of root cellars giving way to the cold of deep caves, then to a penetrating chill that seemed to operate independently of air temperature, as if the cold originated from the stone itself. The lantern light continued to dim until it provided only enough illumination to see perhaps 6 feet ahead, the darkness beyond remaining absolute dot at the bottom of the stairs. The space opened into a chamber. Briggs held his failing lantern high and saw walls that curved away into shadow, a ceiling lost in darkness overhead, and a floor covered with symbols similar to those on the maps upstairs. But these symbols were carved into the stone with depth and precision that spoke of immense labor or impossible tools. Each character was perhaps 2 feet across, arranged in patterns that suggested language, mathematics, or some fusion of both. The stone itself was wrong, not limestone or sandstone or any sedimentary rock native to the Ozarks, but something darker, denser, its surface reflecting the lantern light with an oily sheen that seemed almost organic. The chamber possessed architectural features that violated everything Briggs understood about construction in frontier territories. Columns rose from floor to ceiling, their surfaces carved with spiraling patterns that drew the eye upward and created the illusion of movement, as if the stone was slowly rotating despite remaining perfectly still. Archways opened onto passages that led deeper into the hillside, each arch decorated with symbols that seemed to change depending on the angle of viewing, transforming from geometric patterns into something approaching pictographic representation, human figures, or things that resembled human figures engaged in activities that defied comfortable interpretation. One of the veterans, a man named Garrett who'd survived the siege of Santiago, approached the nearest column and placed his hand against the carved surface. He jerked back immediately, his palm red as if burned, though the stone radiated only cold. "It's moving," he said, his voice tight. "Under the surface, something's moving under the stone." Briggs ordered him to step back, to keep his hands to himself, and turned his attention to the passages. 3 archways presented themselves, each identical in dimension and decoration. He chose the central passage because it seemed the most direct route into the hillside, and because all choices at this point felt equally arbitrary. The passage was wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, the ceiling high enough that even the tallest among them didn't need to duck. The walls showed the same unexplained stone, the same oily sheen, and at intervals, niches had been carved into the walls, small alcoves, perhaps 18 inches deep and 2 feet high. These niches contained objects. In the first niche, Briggs found a clay vessel decorated with patterns he recognized as Mississippian, the kind of pottery produced by indigenous peoples who'd built the great mound cities along the Mississippi River Valley nearly 1,000 years ago. But the vessel sat beside a bronze figurine that appeared Mesopotamian in origin, and next to that, a carved jade pendant that looked Chinese. The juxtaposition made no archaeological sense. These artifacts represented cultures separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years, yet they rested together as if their placement followed some organizing principle invisible to conventional understanding. The second niche contained books, not printed volumes, but handwritten manuscripts on vellum and parchment, their pages covered in scripts that shifted between recognizable alphabets, Latin, Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, and stranger characters that resembled writing but possessed a geometrical precision, suggesting mathematical notation rather than language. Briggs reached for one of the volumes, then hesitated, his hand hovering inches from the leather binding. Something about the books emanated wrongness, a quality of having been written by minds operating according to fundamentally different principles of thought. Sheriff, one of the hunters, called from farther down the passage. "You need to see this." Briggs left the books undisturbed and moved toward the hunter's voice. The man stood before a niche that contained no artifacts, only a piece of paper, modern paper, not parchment or vellum, but ordinary writing paper of the kind available at any general store. On the paper, written in neat script, was a message: Deputy M. Thorne, Newton County. Arrived September 23, 1899. Proceeded to 3rd depth. Did not return. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the implication was devastating. Someone had documented Thorne's presence here, had tracked his movements deeper into the cellar, and had noted his failure to emerge. The clinical tone of the message, its bureaucratic efficiency, suggested record-keeping rather than testimony, as if the cellar maintained its own archive of visitors, its own ledger of souls consumed. Briggs took the paper, folded it carefully, and placed it in his coat pocket. Evidence, something concrete to bring back to the surface, something that could be shown to judges and journalists as proof that Michael Thorne had descended into this place and met an unspecified fate. The hunter who'd found the message was staring into the darkness ahead. his rifle held across his chest in a defensive posture that suggested he'd seen something in the shadows that his mind refused to process. "What's down there?" Briggs asked. "More," the hunter said. "Just more. More passages, more chambers, more of everything. It goes on forever." They continued deeper, the passage descending at a gentle grade that would have been imperceptible except for the accumulating sense of depth, the increasing pressure of stone overhead, the growing conviction that they'd traveled far beyond the boundaries of the hillside, and now walked through spaces that couldn't possibly exist within the mountain's physical limits. The air grew colder still and drier, with a sterility that suggested neither fresh circulation nor stagnant enclosure, but rather air that had never been breathed, that existed in a state prior to contamination by living processes. The passage opened into a second chamber, larger than the first, its dimensions impossible to gauge because the lantern light failed to reach the far walls or ceiling. But what they could see arrested all forward movement and destroyed any remaining pretense of rational explanation. The chamber contained a city, or the suggestion of a city, or perhaps the blueprint of a city, as if someone had begun constructing an urban landscape underground and then abandoned the project in its early stages. Buildings rose from the stone floor, but these structures were more grown than built, their walls possessing an organic quality, surfaces marked by patterns that resembled tree rings, or the world structure of bone. Streets ran between the buildings in layouts that obeyed no practical planning, curving back on themselves, intersecting at impossible angles, creating geometries that hurt to follow with the eye. And throughout this underground cityscape, scattered like fallen leaves, lay pieces of clothing. Briggs recognized some of the garments. Thomas Wicklow's surveying vest, its pockets still bulging with the tools of his trade. Cyrus Heath's leather coat, the one he'd worn for 2 decades of trapping, its surface marked with stains and repairs that told the story of a hard-used life. And there, folded with mechanical precision on the step of one of the strange buildings, Deputy Thorne's remaining clothing, his boots, his badge, his watch on its chain, but no bodies, no remains, no blood or bone or hair, only the clothes, arranged as if their owners had simply stepped out of them and walked away into architecture that denied all conventional spatial relationships. "Jesus Christ," Garrett whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the vast chamber, the words returning from multiple directions, as if the space possessed acoustics that reflected sound through dimensions unavailable to light. One of the hunters broke. The man simply turned and ran back toward the passage, his boots hammering against stone, his breathing loud and ragged. Briggs let him go. No point in forcing men to confront what they couldn't psychologically accommodate. The hunter would either find his way back to the surface, or he wouldn't. And either outcome existed beyond Briggs's capacity to influence. The remaining 3 men moved among the buildings, documenting what they could, though documentation felt increasingly futile. How do you describe architecture that shifts at the periphery of vision, that seems to reconfigure itself when not directly observed? Briggs saw doorways that led into interiors larger than the exterior buildings could contain. He saw windows that showed views of landscapes that weren't the Ozarks' glimpses of deserts under alien stars, forests of crystalline trees, oceans that moved with a viscosity suggesting something other than water. In the center of the chamber, where all the curved streets seemed to eventually lead, stood a structure that dwarfed the surrounding buildings, a tower, or perhaps a well, a cylindrical shaft that descended deeper into the earth, while simultaneously rising toward a ceiling that remained invisible in darkness. Stairs spiraled around the shaft's exterior, wide enough for single file, lacking railings or protective barriers. The shaft itself emitted no light, but it wasn't dark instead. It seemed to exist in a state prior to the distinction between illumination and shadow, as if the concepts of light and dark hadn't yet been differentiated within that space. Third depth, Garrett said, reading a symbol carved into the stone at the stairway's base. That's what the note said. Thorne went to third depth. Briggs looked at the spiraling stairs, at the shaft that descended toward realms he couldn't conceptualize, and understood with absolute clarity that this was a threshold he would not cross. Whatever lay below had already claimed Michael Thorne and 4 other souls, had stripped them of everything that made them physically human and incorporated them into something that operated according to rules, foreign to surface reality, that to follow them down would constitute not investigation but surrender. He made his decision. They would return to the surface, would document what they'd seen, would bring back evidence of the cellar's existence and Deputy Thorne's presence within it. And then he would do what frontier law enforcement had always done when confronted with forces beyond civil authority. He would contain it, would quarantine it, would establish that this property and everything beneath it represented a danger that exceeded county jurisdiction and required intervention from powers greater than his own. The return journey should have been simple: retrace their steps through the passage, cross the first chamber, ascend the stairs. But the cellar had other intentions. The passage they'd followed into the depths had altered. Archways opened onto corridors that hadn't existed during their descent. The niches in the walls now contained different artifacts, modern items. Newspapers from cities Briggs had never visited, photographs of people he didn't recognize, all dated with years that hadn't yet occurred. 1903, 1907, 1912. Objects from the future, if such a thing could be said to exist in the present tense. Garrett stopped at one niche and lifted out a photograph. The image showed a group of soldiers in uniforms Briggs didn't recognize, standing before a landscape of mud and barbed wire. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Third Battle of Ypres, 1917, 2 million casualties. The cellar remains." How? Garrett asked, his voice barely audible. How does it have this? Because it's not under a hill in Arkansas, the remaining hunter said. It's not under anything. We're inside something that exists somewhere else, or somewhen else, or in a place where and when don't apply. They moved faster now, abandoning systematic observation in favor of escape. The passage seemed to stretch, seemed to add distance between themselves and the exit. But Briggs forced himself to maintain steady forward progress. Panic would doom them. The cellar seemed to feed on fear, seemed to use disorientation as a tool for keeping visitors within its boundaries. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on maintaining a bearing that felt correct even when his senses insisted they were moving in circles after what felt like hours, but might have been minutes' time, had become negotiable in the cellars. Depths, they emerged into the first chamber. The stairs rose ahead and above, barely visible through the darkness. A rectangle of lesser shadow marked the trapdoor opening, but something had changed. The chamber was no longer empty. Figures stood among the columns, silent and motionless, their forms difficult to resolve in the failing lantern light. They were human-shaped, but their proportions seemed incorrect. Limbs too long or positioned at joints that shouldn't exist. Heads that possessed a bilateral symmetry that mimicked human skull structure. while introducing subtle variations that transformed familiar anatomy into something deeply wrong. "Don't look at them," Briggs ordered. "Don't engage. Just move toward the stairs." The figures didn't pursue, didn't approach, didn't show any sign of awareness of the three men crossing the chamber. They simply stood, their presence transforming the space from ancient architecture into something approaching a gathering, as if the cellar were inhabited by entities that assembled when visitors penetrated to sufficient depth. Observers that emerged to witness the retreat of those who'd survived the deeper levels. Briggs reached the stairs and began ascending, his companions close behind. The figures remained below, their stillness more disturbing than any pursuit could have been. With each step upward, the temperature increased, the air growing less sterile, the stone walls transitioning from that strange dark material back to the more conventional limestone of Ozark caves. The trap-door opening expanded, revealing not darkness but the interior of the cabin. Lamplight in domestic space and reality governed by recognizable physical laws. They emerged into the cabin to find the sisters, exactly where they'd been when the descent began. Maeve standing by the open trapdoor, Renna seated at the table with her maps. The 7 men who'd remained above ground stood along the walls, their weapons drawn but lowered, their faces showing the strain of maintaining watch over women who'd done nothing threatening but radiated a potential for incomprehensible action that kept nerves taut. Briggs pulled himself up through the trapdoor, his legs shaking from something beyond physical exertion. Garrett and the hunter followed, and the moment the last man cleared the opening, Maeve lowered the door. It closed with a sound like finality, like a book slamming shut, and the seams between planks disappeared completely, leaving the floor apparently solid and unbroken. "You didn't bring him back," Maeve observed, her pale eyes tracking Briggs with that same inventory-taking attention. "Where is Deputy Thorne?" Briggs demanded, his voice rougher than intended. "What happened to him?" "He went deeper than you did," Renna answered, not looking up from her maps. "He wanted to understand. That's always the problem. People who want to understand end up becoming part of what they're trying to understand. The cellar doesn't kill people, it incorporates them. They become aspects of its structure, part of its ongoing existence." "That's insane," one of the deputies said. "You're talking about a cave system, not a living thing." Renna finally looked up, and her stained hands spread flat against the map on the table. "I'm talking about something that exists in the spaces between definitions. It's a cave in the sense that it's underground and made of stone. It's a structure in the sense that it has architecture and organization. It's a living thing in the sense that it grows and changes and consumes. All of these descriptions are accurate and incomplete. Your language wasn't designed to accommodate what it is." Briggs fought to maintain investigative clarity against the rising tide of cosmic horror. He was a sheriff, not a philosopher. His job was to enforce laws, maintain order, protect citizens. But what law applied to a cellar that contained cities and artifacts from cultures separated by continents and millennia? What order could be maintained in the face of architecture that defied spatial constraints? What protection could he offer against something that transformed human beings into structural elements of its own impossible geometry? "How long has this been here?" he asked, trying to find solid ground in historical fact. "Always," Maeve said. "Or it arrived long enough ago that always is the only meaningful time frame. We've been its watchers for 3 generations. Our grandmother found this place in 1847, drawn here by dreams that weren't dreams, by instructions that came from somewhere that isn't quite a place. She understood that the cellar needed witnesses, needed people to maintain the boundary between what it is and what the world above thinks is possible. Watchers, Briggs repeated. You watch it do what? Exist, Renner said. The cellar exists in a state that requires observation to maintain stability. Without watchers, it would expand, would breach containment, would begin manifesting in locations beyond this hollow. We keep it localized. We maintain the threshold. We ensure that it remains a destination rather than becoming an invasion. The implications were staggering. These two women, living in isolation on an impossible slope, were apparently serving as some kind of mystical containment system for an entity or structure or phenomenon that threatened to metastasize across reality if left unmasked. Briggs had no framework for processing this claim, no precedent in law or experience that helped him evaluate its credibility. But he'd been in the cellar. He'd seen the underground city, the artifacts from impossible sources, the shaft descending toward third depth and whatever lay beyond. Something was happening in this hollow that exceeded natural explanation, and the sisters' role as watchers, however insane it sounded, possessed an internal consistency that made it difficult to dismiss. The people who disappeared, Briggs pressed. The surveyor, the trapper, Deputy Thorne. What happens to them? They go down, Maeve said. They hear the calling, not sound, but a pull, a sense that something below requires their presence. Most people can resist it. They feel the pull and it makes them uncomfortable, makes them want to leave the area, and they do. But some people are constituted in ways that make them susceptible. They feel the pull and interpret it as curiosity, as investigative duty, as the need to understand. Those people go down, and the deeper they go, the harder it becomes to return. By the time they reach third depth, they're not coming back. They've already begun the transition into being part of the cellar structure. Can the process be reversed? Garrett asked. If we went down with more men, better equipment? No, Renner interrupted. You can't rescue someone from becoming architecture. They're not trapped down there, waiting for salvation. They've been transformed into something that exists in relation to the cellar rather than in opposition to it. The person you knew is gone. What remains is something else, something that serves the cellar's purposes in ways we don't fully understand. Briggs looked at his men, saw the exhaustion and fear and growing panic in their faces. They'd accomplished nothing except confirming that the disappearances were real, that Deputy Thorne was gone beyond recovery, and that the sisters possessed knowledge of something that shouldn't exist but manifestly did. He had no legal authority to arrest the women. They'd committed no crime that any court would recognize. He had no practical means of destroying or sealing the cellar. Conventional excavation or demolition would likely just expose whatever existed below to broader access. His only option was retreat, documentation, and escalation to authorities with resources beyond county jurisdiction. We're leaving, Briggs announced. But this isn't over. I'll be reporting everything we found here to the State Attorney General, to federal authorities if necessary. This property will be seized. This structure will be examined by people with expertise beyond frontier law enforcement. Maeve and Renner exchanged a glance that communicated something between resignation and amusement. You can report whatever you want, Maeve said. They won't believe you. Or they'll believe you and wish they hadn't. The cellar has been investigated before, by people with more education and better equipment than you possess. The results are always the same: confusion, failure, and the addition of more watchers who go down and don't come back. Are you prisoners here? One of the hunters asked suddenly. You said your grandmother found this place. Are you being held here by whatever's below? Rena smiled for the first time, an expression that transformed her face into something almost human before the smile faded and took the humanity with it. We're here because we choose to be. Because someone needs to maintain the watch. Because the alternative, leaving the cellar unmonitored, would result in catastrophes that would make these local disappearances seem like mercy. We're not prisoners. We're volunteers in a war you don't know is being fought. The party departed the cabin without further conversation, mounted their horses, and began the long ride down the mountain. Briggs looked back once from the ridge above the hollow, saw the cabin still perched on its impossible slope, smoke finally rising from the chimney as if the sisters had decided that the necessary pretense of normalcy could now be resumed. The structure looked exactly as it had during their approach, weathered, isolated, utterly unremarkable except for its defiance of basic geological probability. The ride back to town took longer than the journey up, or perhaps it only felt longer because each man was alone with thoughts too large and dark to share. They arrived after nightfall, the horses exhausted, the men more so. Briggs dismissed the party with instructions to say nothing about what they'd seen until he'd filed his official report. He doubted they'd comply. Trauma of this magnitude demanded release through testimony, but he needed time to construct a narrative that might survive contact with bureaucratic skepticism. He spent 3 days writing the report, drafting and redrafting, trying to find language that conveyed the facts without sounding like the ravings of someone suffering wilderness-induced delusion. The final version was sparse, clinical, stripped of emotional content. It documented the disappearances, described the expedition to the Hadwin property, detailed the discovery of the cellar and its impossible contents, and concluded with a recommendation that the property be seized under eminent domain and the cellar sealed by military engineers. The report was forwarded to the State Attorney General's office in Little Rock. 2 weeks later, Briggs received a response. The Attorney General thanked him for his thorough investigation, noted the unusual circumstances surrounding the disappearances, and regretfully informed him that the state lacked jurisdiction to seize private property based on the described findings. If Sheriff Briggs believed that criminal activity had occurred on the Hadwin property, he was encouraged to gather evidence sufficient to support arrest warrants and prosecution under existing statutes. Translation: you're on your own. Whatever's happening in that hollow exceeds our willingness to acknowledge or address. Briggs tried other avenues. He wrote to the Department of the Interior, suggesting that the cellar represented a geological phenomenon worthy of scientific study. He contacted the Smithsonian Institution, describing the artifacts he'd seen and proposing a formal archaeological investigation. He even reached out to professors at Eastern universities, men who studied folklore and anthropology and the stranger aspects of American frontier history. The responses ranged from polite dismissal to concerned suggestions that Sheriff Briggs might benefit from an extended rest away from the demands of office. No one wanted to pursue investigation of a cellar that contained impossible architecture and consumed people who ventured too deep. The phenomenon was too far outside accepted reality to be professionally addressed. Academia and government alike chose to treat the matter as local superstition, best left to resolve itself in whatever way. Frontier mysteries typically resolve themselves through gradual abandonment and eventual erasure from collective memory. 3 months after the expedition, in the deep cold of January 1900, Sheriff Briggs received word that the Hadwin sisters had disappeared. A trapper passing through the hollow had noticed that no smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, despite temperatures well below freezing. He'd investigated and found the structure empty, the door standing open, the interior showing no sign of struggle or hasty departure. The sisters' possessions remained in place, their clothes hung on pegs, their supplies stocked in the pantry, their mysterious maps still spread across the table. But Maeve and Rena Hadwin were gone, and no tracks led away from the property through the January snow. Briggs rode up to the hollow with 2 deputies, more out of professional obligation than any hope of finding useful evidence. The cabin looked exactly as the trapper had described, abandoned but not ransacked, empty but not violated. It was as if the sisters had simply ceased to exist mid-routine, their lives interrupted between one moment and the next. The trapdoor in the floor remained closed, its seams still invisible, and when Briggs tried to pry it open, the wood refused to yield. It wasn't locked or stuck, simply wouldn't open, as if the door had become purely decorative, a representation of an entrance rather than an entrance itself. They searched the property thoroughly, found nothing that explained the sisters' disappearance, and departed with the uneasy conviction that Maeve and Rena had gone down. They'd maintained their watch for 3 generations. And now that watch had ended in the only way it could end for those who stood too long at the threshold of something that required observation to remain contained. That night, sleeping fitfully in his office because he couldn't face going home to dreams of underground cities, Briggs was awakened by a sound like thunder that came from beneath rather than above. The ground shook for perhaps 10 seconds, a tremor to sustain to be natural earthquake activity. In the morning, he learned that the tremor had been centered in the hollow where the Hadwin property stood. He rode up immediately, bringing every available man, expecting to find the cabin collapsed or the hillside fallen in. What he found was worse, perhaps better, depending on perspective. The cabin was gone. Not collapsed, but gone. The level space where it had stood for decades now showed only disturbed earth, as if the structure had been plucked from the hillside by enormous hands. The ground had subsided, creating a depression perhaps 20 feet across and 15 feet deep. At the bottom of this depression, barely visible beneath loose soil and rock, were the remains of stone architecture columns broken off at ground level, partial archways, carved surfaces that matched what Briggs had seen in the cellar. The hollow had swallowed the cabin and sealed the cellar. Beneath 30 tons of collapsed earth, the Hadwin sisters were gone, presumably taken down into depths, where human identity dissolved into something that served the cellar's incomprehensible purposes. The disappearances stopped immediately. Thomas Wicklow, Cyrus Heath, Deputy Michael Thorne, their fates remained unknown. But no new victims vanished from the hills surrounding the hollow. Sheriff Briggs filed a final report, documenting the cabin's disappearance as the result of a structural sinkhole, a natural geological event that had regrettably claimed the lives of 2 residents. The report made no mention of cellars or underground cities or architecture that defied spatial constraints. It was a lie, but a necessary one, the kind of lie that civilization tells itself to avoid confronting forces that exceed human capacity for understanding or control. The case was officially closed. The property was abandoned, deemed too unstable for future habitation. Over the following years, vegetation reclaimed the hollow. Trees grew over the depression where the cabin had stood. The area became one more forgotten place in the endless folds of the Ozark Mountains, visited by no one, remembered by few, But in 1904, 5 years after the cabin's collapse, reports emerged from a different part of the Appalachian Rangerstorm, Kentucky, 100 miles from the Newton County Hollow. A hunter had discovered a structure partially buried in a hillside. Stone architecture of a style that didn't match any known indigenous or colonial construction. Initial excavation revealed a stairway descending into the earth, walls covered with carved symbols, and a layout that seemed to shift between the excavators' visits to the site. The structure appeared to be a cellar, though no building stood above it. Its origins were unknown, its age impossible to determine, and its depth uncertain because passages continued beyond the range that early investigators dared to explore. The cellar in Kentucky was identical to the one beneath the Hadwin property. Identical in every detail, the same stone, the same carvings, the same architectural impossibilities, as if the structure hadn't been destroyed by the Newton County collapse but had simply moved, relocating to a new site where it could continue its existence undisturbed by human investigation. And at the Kentucky site, 2 women had appeared, living in a crude shelter near the partially exposed entrance. They were young, perhaps in their 20s, and they spoke little to the locals. But those who traded with them reported that the women seemed intensely focused on the excavation, that they watched the site with a vigilance that suggested duty rather than curiosity. They called themselves the Watchers, and they warned that the cellar should be left undisturbed, that some explorations led to transformations from which no return was possible. The women's names were not Hadwin, but their pale eyes and stained hands and the way they moved through the world with the patient attention of those maintaining vigil over something vast and hungry. These were identical to the sisters who'd disappeared from a hollow in Arkansas 5 years earlier. Sheriff Coleman Briggs heard these reports in his retirement, too old now to pursue investigation, too tired to fight battles he'd already lost. He understood what the Kentucky discovery meant, that the cellar was not a place but a phenomenon, not a fixed location but a manifestation that could occur wherever the right geological and perhaps metaphysical conditions aligned. The sisters were not individuals but a role, a function that perpetuated itself across time and distance, maintaining watch over something that predated human civilization and would likely outlast it. He died in 1911, without ever speaking publicly about what he'd seen beneath the Hadwin property. His personal papers, discovered after his death, included detailed accounts of the expedition, descriptions of the underground city, and a final note written in a shaking hand. I have learned that some frontiers are not meant to be explored. We build our civilization on ground that contains depths we were never meant to comprehend. The cellar exists in those depths, and it will continue to exist long after our nation and all our confident mapping of reality has been forgotten. God have mercy on those it calls, for they will know a transformation that places them forever beyond the reach of human compassion. The Newton County Hollow remains empty. The Kentucky site was abandoned after several investigators disappeared, and the local authorities deemed the structure too dangerous for further exploration. But travelers in the Appalachian Mountains sometimes report finding stone structures partially buried in remote hillsides, architectural anomalies that suggest passages descending into the earth. And near these sites, occasionally, there are women watching pallid, stained-handed, patient in ways that exceed normal human attention spans. The cellar continues. The watchers maintain their vigil. And in the deep places beneath the ancient mountains, in chambers that exist in dimensions our geometry cannot quite accommodate, the disappeared perform whatever function the cellar requires of them. transformed into elements of something too vast and strange to be opposed, only observed and contained and quietly feared.